Chapter 7. It was 6 o'clock, already dark, and the mature shrubs that lined their drive shivered in the hastening wind as she edged her new car in alongside Patrick's old Saab. The temperature had dropped sharply over the course of the day, and the forecast for the weekend warned of gales and torrential rain, and as the first drops dotted the windscreen, Maggie felt glad to be home. Her hands full, she pressed the doorbell with her nose, but with no response forthcoming, put down bottle, handbag, and laptop, located her door key, and let herself in. She discovered Patrick upstairs, soaking in the bath, a John Martin CD blaring from the small machine in their bedroom. She found him lying back in the water, eyes closed, head swaying to the rhythm of the music, quite unaware of her presence as she leaned against the door jamb. For once completely free to observe him, she'd forgotten just how pale was his body, despite seeing it almost every day. His torso had thickened in his 40s, and the fact that he could stand to lose a few pounds was evidenced by the way the crown of his belly reached the surface of the water like a small island. In the shallows, his penis dancing this way and that, creating little eddies above itself, such that it seemed to her a quite semi-detached thing, perhaps not unlike the wife that she'd become. A comparison she had little desire to pursue right now, for she knew it didn't always pay to inquire too deeply into things. You're likely to reach conclusions and then have to do something about them. She assumed that was why she'd entered an affair rather than therapy. Besides, with Patrick so prominent in his field, to whom could she possibly have confided? Her eyes travelled up her husband's body until she regarded his face, eyes still closed, head floating from side to side on the tide of the song, lips mouthing the words. Like a small child engrossed in the delight of his own senses, he remained oblivious to her presence, and for once truly vulnerable. She was disturbed to realise how unsure she was of her feelings about his vulnerability. It wasn't always so. It was those glimpses of the relaxed, unself-conscious young man that she had initially fallen in love with, but which had become so maddeningly elusive once he began training as a counsellor. She used to wonder if he let go elsewhere, with colleagues, friends, a lover perhaps. Most likely with colleagues, for he had no real friends anymore. Maggie assumed there might have been some sort of fling with a fellow trainee back during Patrick's residential training with Relate. With a ratio of 6 women to every man, there was no shortage of opportunity, but she never asked, and he never said. Besides, she could see it was the work he was infatuated with, and any woman, however attractive, would have had to put up with coming a poor second. Unaware that her gaze had shifted from Patrick's face to the wall above the bath, and had lost itself in a patterned tile, Maggie failed to register that the track had ended, or that Patrick's eyes were now wide open, staring at her. "Christ," he said, making her jump. "I could have been murdered in my bath. What a way to go, and to the strains of Johnny Too Bad. How appropriate. Hello, darling. I'd invite you in, but there's not enough room." "There was a time," she said, gathering her composure. "Of course, we were both slimmer then," she added, choosing to overlook the fact that she remained the same neat size 10 as when they first met. "That's generous," he said knowingly, and, impervious to any riposte, dunked his head under the water. She stared down into his distorted features as he held his breath for what must have been 20 seconds. He used to tease her like this when they first got together, and he knew how she hated it. She always wanted to walk away, but knew she must wait until he surfaced. A tiny bubble escaped from the corner of his mouth, then another, then nothing more, as he held every fibre of his body still in order to eke out a few more precious seconds. When he finally broke the surface, he looked across to the doorway. It stood empty. That night they made love and had sex, although it was never quite clear who was doing which at any one time. Nonetheless, it seemed to Patrick there was more to it than their usual well-choreographed pattern. Something perhaps in the odd moments of stillness, when one or the other was a little more open, a little more aware of what was being given, what was being received. He pondered this as he lay in the dark afterwards, and whether it was worth remarking upon. He was still considering it as he fell asleep. Maggie lay in the dark, listening to the tap, tap, tap of rain upon the window, and the reassuring sound of Patrick's breath, rising and falling like a low midnight tide caressing the shingles. She thought of his penis inside her just minutes before, a for once not unwelcome guest, who appeared to regard and appreciate her, rather than just taking its fill in return for the earlier product of his lips and fingers. What was missing between herself and Patrick, she realized, was not orgasms. Orgasms are easy. But what she had in abundance with Gavin, and just possibly glimpsed an inkling of again just now. The realization of what it is to play both guest and host, and willingly embrace whichever role is allotted in the moment, in body as in heart and mind. Most men, Patrick once told her, see sex as a means to intimacy, whereas for most women intimacy is a prerequisite for sex. Well, that's a recipe for frustration if ever there was one, she'd replied. But when she was with Gavin, intimacy and lust were like tango dancers, each taking turns to forge ahead, but maintaining perfect contact throughout. Her chest swelled as she drew a long, deep breath, and her thoughts sailed away over rooftops, gardens, pavements, streets, and countless secret spaces of the heart, to the bed where her lover lay asleep, his last night in that anonymous hotel room, and she planted a kiss on the small of his neck and felt his flesh quiver. She imagined Gavin's wife, Vicky, lying awake, trying to piece together the shattered fragments of her marriage. The bed's too big, the frying pan's too wide, as the old Joni Mitchell song put it so acutely. Surely Vicky must have realized the vital piece of the jigsaw was missing, thought Maggie, before her thoughts left Vicky and returned to that warm berth inside her, that these past few months she had been giving so freely to Gavin, and into which, just moments ago, her husband unloaded his own soft cargo, which now oozed and seeped into the fine Egyptian cotton sheet. She and Patrick were well practised at living together. They still fitted, but no longer well enough. And in her heart Maggie knew as much, which is why the more meaningful wet patch was the one spreading slowly, relentlessly across her pillow.